Yeah. So just to go through some stuff from the other day, just to clarify some stuff about transformers, and there's some stuff to do at the end. Okay. So first of all, what is a transformer? We're talking about obviously electrical devices, not the movie franchise. So they're a device that's used to change the voltage of electrical power. It has to be AC power. I'll come back to that a little bit later. It doesn't work with DC. They can be used to either increase voltage, which is called a step-up transformer. They can decrease voltage, which is called a step-down transformer, or you can have something that's an isolation transformer, which actually just gives you the same voltage, but it's used as a safety device because it reduces the chance of getting an electrical shock. So this is the typical sort of diagram of a transformer. So you've got a transformer core, which is made of iron. It's usually laminated iron, so it's not one solid chunk. It's lots of thin sheets glued together. And around one side you have a coil of wire wrapped around one side called the primary coil. That's where you put electricity in. And around the other side you have another coil of wire where the electricity comes out. Now it's important that those coils are both electrically insulated from the core. They're not conducting electricity into the core or anything, so they're like separated by like an insulation layer. Okay? So there's no electrical connection, but there is a magnetic connection between them. So the important thing is the process is that when you change the current in the primary coil, which is why it has to be AC, you produce a changing magnetic flux in the iron core. Okay, so a current through a coil produces a magnetic field, and a magnetic field produces a flux. If you change the current, you change the magnetic field, so you change the flux. If you change the magnetic flux in the core, it induces an EMF. Okay, that's like Faraday's law. The induced EMF is the rate of change of flux. Now, the magnetic flux produced in the primary coil is present all the way through the entire core, including through the secondary. Now, if that secondary coil, as in this diagram, has fewer turns, so there's less turns in the secondary coil than in the primary, you've got the same amount of flux through each turn of the coil. Okay, but if you have more turns, that means you've got overall more flux through your coil as a whole. So if you've got a coil with 10 turns in it, for example, you've got 10 times the flux that you would have with just one coil. But if you've got, like in this example, the secondary coil has fewer turns than the primary, then you're going to have less overall flux in the secondary. So you're going to have a lower induced voltage. So that will produce a lower voltage than you put in at the start. And that would be a step-down transformer. If, on the other hand, you did the opposite, if you had a coil where the secondary coil had more turns, that would mean you would be inducing a larger overall flux, change in flux in the secondary coil. So you'd have a larger induced voltage. So that would be a step-up transformer. So you'd get more voltage out than you put in. Now we can actually calculate how much voltage you could get out. Now this is basically just an application of Faraday's law. I'm not going to go through the derivation of it, but ultimately the ratio of the number of turns is the same as the ratio of voltages. So if your secondary coil, for example, has half the number of turns, it's going to also have half the voltage of the primary. So if, for example, we'll put some numbers on it on this one. Let's say we've got a primary that's got 300 turns, and we put 240 volts. That's 240 volts AC. We'll get to AC things later, but let's just, for now, just accept that. And let's say we've got a secondary that's got 125 turns. How much voltage are we going to get out of that? So if we basically just plug those numbers in to that formula, NP is the number of turns in the primary, 300, divided by the NS, the number of turns in the secondary, 125, is going to be 240, the voltage in the primary divided by the voltage in the secondary. We want to find the voltage in the secondary. So if we rearrange that for Vs, we get this expression, 240 times 125 over 300, and if you plug those numbers in, you get a secondary voltage of 100 volts. So we would get 100 volts out of that transformer. Okay. Now, that was making an assumption that we get all of the power out. So an ideal transformer, we assume it's 100% efficient. That means all of the power we put into the primary all comes out of the secondary. So you can express that as the power in the primary equals the power of the secondary. Okay. So if we express power as IV, current times voltage, we could express it this way. Now, if we took that same setup before, if we say we've got this 240 volts to 100 volt transformer, and let's say we had 1.25 amps going into the primary, I just made that number up, okay? How much current would we get out of the secondary? So if we assume that we're getting 100% efficiency, we can look at it like this. We basically just plug in, we can calculate the power in the primary, and the power in the secondary will be the current, IS, what we're trying to find, multiplied by the voltage, 100. So we could calculate the secondary current by just rearranging that, and we would get 3 amps. So ideally, we would expect that this, if it's 100% efficient, we're putting all the power we put in. In this case, if you multiply the voltage by the current in the primary, you get 300 watts. And then if you multiply the voltage by the current in the secondary, you also get 300 watts. So we would expect all of that power to go in. But in reality, you always lose a little bit of power. Not a lot, but you lose some power, usually in the core. Because you've got a changing flux in the core, you actually induce currents in the core itself as well. And those are called eddy currents. They're not useful. You can't use the current for anything, but because there's charge flowing around, it does heat the core up, which, dissipates some of the energy. So, for example, a more realistic situation might be if we're putting our 240 volts and 1.25 amps in. So we're putting in the power of 300 watts, but we might not be getting quite what we expected out. Like we might only get 98 volts rather than the 100 volts we were expecting. And we might get only 2.98 amps rather than the 3 amps we were expecting. So that means we're only getting a secondary power. If you multiply the current by the voltage, we're only getting 292 watts out rather than the 300 watts we were putting in. And that the difference has been lost as heat. So we usually express efficiency as a percentage. So it's basically what percentage of the power is transmitted through to the secondary. So expressing the secondary power as a percentage of the primary. So we can just express it as the secondary power divided by the primary power multiplied by 100 to make it a percentage. So in this case, we'd get 292 divided by 300, multiply 100, you'd get 97%. So that, in that case, it would be a 97% efficient transformer. And most high power transformers that are used in transmission grids for electricity are about 98 to 99% efficient. So the smaller the transformer is, the less efficient it is. But they're relatively efficient devices, but not. In the real world, they're not perfect. Most exam questions would assume 100% efficiency. Okay, so a bit of stuff to do on this. There's some stuff on Education Perfect. There's a section called Transformers, which in my class I've said that for you, but you could just search it up. And also, if you've got the Physics 3 workbook with you on pages 311, 312, there's some stuff on transformers there too.